Hi, I'm John Atack.
And I'm Daniel Shaw. I
And
am an author. My book is called Traumatic Narcissism, Relational Systems of Subjugation. And I'm a psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City.
great. And we first spoke about 5 years ago, I think. And
That's right.
I was delighted to meet you, and we've sort of fallen out of touch. And so I'm very glad to be back in touch. Let me say that there are so many books in this area that it's really good to find a book that has unique content and says something about, you know, one of the essential problems, which that there are people out there who are narcissistic and who will traumatize the people around them. I tend to use the term human predator.
Yes, and I think that's an excellent term.
Yeah, thank you. So your background was with Siddha Yoga, is it?
Siddha Yoga. Yeah, I met Swami Muktananda on his third world tour when he came to New York. He was upstate. I was an actor at the time. I was having a hard time, very hard time, very discouraged in my life at that point, end of my 20s. And he had a large following in the theater community. And so people that I knew were telling me, oh, you should meet him, you should meditate with him. He's in New York. And he had celebrities who would offer, introductory kinds of programs. And I went to one that Marsha Mason, the actress, was hosting up in his ashram. And then I went to meet him. I had a friend who was involved, a good friend. We're still good friends. And I pretty much got hooked within the first 6 months, I'd say. And then by 6 months after that, I left my apartment and I moved into the ashram. And within a few years, I joined. Muktananda died. He was succeeded by two, brother and sister, Gurumai and her brother, who was called Nityananda. I followed the sister, and pretty quickly the sister kicked the brother out. It was a ugly and violent coup that she led with her partner, a man named George Afif, who was like the co-guru in a sort of a secret way. And I rose up in the ranks from there, following Gurumai on her tour. And I left finally in 1994, at which point I entered grad school to become a psychotherapist. And it was I decided to write about traumatic abuse and cults for my graduate degree. And that, in a way, is the nucleus of the book I ended up writing 20 years later.
Yeah. And I mean, it is fascinating when you study the one after another of the leaders of groups, you know, some of the famous ones like Rajneesh or Sun Myung Moon, that they share so many characteristics in common.
Indeed.
And I mean, I got very interested in the whole notion of narcissism because, well, that's the sort of person I am. And I found out that it was Erich Fromm who came up with the term malignant narcissism.
Right, exactly.
In a book called The Heart of Man in 1964. Right. And the last couple of years, I've read half a dozen of his books, and there are bits and pieces where he's wrong, for sure. I mean, certainly his homophobic statements are, way off the mark. But it was commonly, I think, up until 1993. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual still held that homosexuality was a psychiatric illness, So
yes, unfortunately, yeah.
But putting that aside, his other ideas, and his first book, Escape from Freedom, in 1941, when he'd come from Nazi Germany in 1933, he's part of the Frankfurt School, and they threw him out because they said he'd become American. He was becoming too hopeful about humanity, which we should never do. And he'd softened his Marxist position, and he was not being a Freudian purist, although of course he was a psychoanalyst until his death in 1980. But in Escape from Freedom, he brings forth this concept of the pseudo self, which I find fascinating, that he says basically people don't grow up. They don't mature properly. So they look around them to see what they're meant to look like and how they're meant to behave. They keep up with the Joneses, or, so they don't develop. And later on, he comes up with this notion of the malignant narcissist. And this begs a question about, well, what about the benign narcissist? And as his formulation for the narcissist, unlike Havelock Ellis, who first used the term, or Freud, who used it soon afterwards, Freud is saying this is somebody who only loves himself, where Fromm is saying, no, this is somebody who does not know how to love, and that's why they haven't matured. And I think there's a very fascinating and simple idea in there, that he's saying that the problem, they need adulation, they need somebody so that they feel whole, so that they feel they have a self. That's a long preamble, excuse me.
No,
you reflect upon it?
I was influenced very strongly both by Escape from Freedom and by the chapter on narcissism in The Heart of Man, and it strongly backed up the less articulated thoughts that I was having about how to understand the guru. Fromm's work on malignant narcissism are very much a part of what I've tried to incorporate in my own work on traumatic narcissism. Heinz Kohut also complicated the whole idea of narcissism, because he introduced the idea of healthy narcissism or healthy self-love. I feel like it's all very confusing, and we ought to call that self-esteem or self-regard, and not call it.
I couldn't agree more.
And not be calling it healthy narcissism, because I think narcissism is based on Ovid's myth of a forest creature, more of a man than not, but something of a mixture of something, a magical creature and man, who, is frozen in place by looking at his reflection, and who dies on the spot, unable to love. And the story also includes, of course, Echo, who adores Narcissus, who Narcissus rejects in a very cruel way. And Echo's adoration leads to the loss of her body and her soul and her voice, and she becomes merely an echo. So the Ovid's tale is very instructive, and what I felt about narcissism, which I thought of all the analysts, and by the way, Fromm was a Forensian more than a Freudian. As much as he understood and knew Freud, he valued and he elevated the work of Ferenczi when Ferenczi was otherwise being marginalized by Freud and by the whole psychoanalytic establishment of the time. Ferenczi has had a tremendous revival since his diaries were published in the late 80s. And in fact, the whole New York psychoanalysis has been upended by Ferenczian thought and theory, and has resulted in the group called the Relational Psychoanalysts, mainly based in New York, but also active in other parts of the world, including Israel and Italy and other areas. So anyway, that's just a little sidebar, I guess. But so for me, what was essential about looking at my cult experience, which lasted all in all 13 years, and which ended just as I began my graduate work in order to become a psychotherapist, was that everything I was reading was focused on who was the cult member or who was the cult survivor. And I had gotten fairly close to Guru Mai towards the last couple of years of while I was there, and I was in charge of a million things, and I was being abused quite severely and directly by her for most of the last year.
And what form did that abuse take?
what form? Public humiliation in particular,
Yeah.
and also, she would have surrogates go after you as well, who would not reveal they were saying what she wanted them to say.
Yeah.
And she tore me down over and over and over in front of people, in phone calls, in messages, on notes. So while being in charge of everything, she was tearing me down quite viciously and hurtfully. Just saying awful things. You have no creativity. You're like an animal. You have a heart of stone. You've never contributed anything, so on and so forth. And of course, I'd been working 18-hour days for, how many years, 7 years straight, with no vacation, no pay, no vacation. This is typical. So this is not a bid for sympathy. Everybody who's been in a cult knows what I'm talking about, at least if you've been in full time.
Yeah.
So I became, upon leaving, very interested in who the hell was this guru? What was going on with these gurus? I quickly learned that they're all the same. They all behave the same way. And their behavior is so strikingly similar. I just thought, I need to understand that psychology. I get my vulnerability. I get my predisposing conditions that might have led me to become that vulnerable. And I understood too how I became so willing to accept abuse. I could understand all of those things. That wasn't the mystery. The mystery was, who is the guru? And narcissism quickly became the best way that I could describe what I had observed and experienced. That this was a person whose primary motivator was to believe in their own omnipotence at any cost. And so, to believe in your own omnipotence, you have to be delusional about who you are.
Yes.
And if you can maintain that delusion, then you don't have to ever experience that you are small or weak or dependent or inferior. You can see those qualities in everyone else, and you can cultivate them in followers, but you can believe that you have none of those qualities. The guru or the traumatizing or malignant narcissist believes, I have no shame, I have no boundaries, I have no guilt, I have no remorse, I have no smallness or insecurities. That's a delusion. And yet, in order to support that delusion, I believe that they really have to use all the powers at their command, whatever they may be, seductiveness, charisma, whatever we want to call it. Money, of course, is big. Using that to make sure that there are always people around them in whom they can project and see all of those qualities that they themselves are disavowing. So that's the basic theory that I wanted to talk about. And in order to talk about that in terms of narcissism, I wanted to be clear. I'm not talking about ordinary narcissism. As Erich Fromm did, I wanted to speak specifically to a person who took all the grandiosity of the narcissist and disavowed any of the insecurity.
Yeah.
Because when we think of pathological narcissists in psychoanalytic theory, we're talking about people who bounce or oscillate from pole to pole. Their grandiosity is underpinned by their insecurity, and their insecurity is underpinned by their grandiosity. And you see both manifesting, and this is what is actually being called pathological narcissism in psychoanalysis. I wanted to say, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a narcissist who fully and successfully deludes themselves in a way that disavows any insecurity, and who then projects that insecurity into followers and maintains followers precisely for that reason, so that they can remain deluded about their omnipotence. So that's the nutshell summary of what I observed.
Fascinating. I mean, and you do see, I mean, what's called the collapsing phase of narcissism. You do see that certainly in studying in way too much depth the life of Ron Hubbard. He had terrible withdrawal, and I spoke with so many people who'd seen him at the point where he was saying, "I'm useless. I've achieved nothing."
Yes.
So he did have that phase, but then
and Om Shinrikyo, you know, upon being captured and imprisoned, he regressed to schizophrenia, basically. And yes, so you're correct. I think I agree with you. Guru Mai is known to have been very bulimic. She's known to have also had a very masochistic relationship to her co-guru, the secret shadow guru, George Rafif. So you know, there is that aspect, but successful gurus hide that until they can't, like Jim Jones, for example.
Absolutely. And I think also there are complicating factors. I sincerely believe that Hubbard was suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy, that he fits 17 of the 18 criteria of the Bear-Fideo characteristics. And my friend Yuval Law, he brought the idea to me, and he did a podcast with Chris Shelton about this, and he was contacted afterwards by a retired professor of neurology who was a Harvard professor, who said he was there when Bear and Fideo gave the lecture in 1977 at Harvard. And so he knew about that. And for 30 years, and he admitted this privately, he'd been collecting everything he could on Ron Hubbard because he just fascinated him. It was his hobby, you know,
Wow.
Hubbard watching. And he hadn't connected the two things. And he said, you know, looking at it as Yuval described it, absolutely, this is the characteristic. But you could also say he was manic depressive. You could also say he was paranoid. And you could find, you know, he has the sadism that comes with the sociopathic, psychopathic. So we get into such a bag of problems.
Well, and there's somebody on Twitter, and I'm forgetting his name, who's quite convinced Donald Trump suffers from that same kind of temporal lobe dementia. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they're very, I mean, the wonderful book, you know, the dangerous case of Donald Trump. I rather like Robert J. Lifton's piece in there. I mean, it's an excellent book, and I'd sort of looked at it and went, oh dear, this is a book written by psychiatrists. This might be hard going. But in fact, it's very easy to read. But the Lifton so often plays the trump card, and he says he's not a narcissist, he's a solipsist. He doesn't believe the rest of the world outside of probably himself and his family. I think they're, you know, as narcissists often, well, can include their offspring as part.
They have somebody they elevate. And, Right.
So, you know, Jared Kushner and people like this have come into the frame. But I was very interested. Craig Malkin, who's I think at Harvard Medical School, wrote a book about narcissism, and it made me think, I think we're using the wrong word here, you know, because as you say, the Ovid story is about self-love, self-adoration, and the fundamental trait, if from it,
but it's about self-adoration that leads to the withering and the annihilation of the person.
Yes, yeah. Malkin puts forward a spectrum from 0 to 10, and he again uses this expression healthy narcissism, which seems conflictual to me. At number 5, we have that. At 0, we have egoism, which is no self. And he says this is a scale of how special you feel. And I have problems with that. That's why I sort of went hooray when you said it's about self-regard and self-worth, because I think that's exactly what it's about. There's a healthy self-regard, and then there's, you know, towards the other end, the people who don't want you to celebrate their birthday, as Malkin points out, and don't want to be noticed, what he calls egoists.
People like that, I would say, are struggling with self-alienation. And self-alienation is often a result of trauma, chronic or cumulative trauma, Because children who are abused or neglected in various ways, from subtle to gross, tend to take the blame upon themselves on trying to preserve a good parent.
Yeah.
And that becomes locked into what used to be called a harsh superego, but what I think of as, an internal conflict between a desire to be loved and good and a sense that you are unlovable and not good. And I would call that self-alienation.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot in members of, I tend to use the term authoritarian group, as cult has become. Authoritarian cult will do, as long as we have something that says that it's basically about one person is in charge and the other person is being told what to do.
Right.
And that to create, to make an adherent, to make somebody who's going to follow you, creating self-hostility and self-hatred in the person is so important.
And exactly, and it's always what happens. You can tell if we're calling anything a cult, that's got to be part of what we're observing.
Yeah, that the person is, I've recently, for the last couple of years, I've been thinking more and more about the notion of an unconscious mind, and the idea that it seems to be popular, that we are inhabited by an agency of which we are not aware, that there is kind of Mr. Hyde inside there. And I've come to the conclusion that demon possession, or the unconscious mind in this sense, is not an adequate description, that there are many unconscious processes, but that, what is conscious and what is not conscious is part of a unity. And what tends to happen is that in religious groups, in therapy groups, the idea of creating this inner enemy who is, plotting against you, I think it's a very dangerous idea. And
I would
reconciling
agree.
and unifying the person is what becomes important then.
I would agree. Well, but interestingly, one of the basic tenets of relational psychoanalysis, which is the school that I relate to most, it also is consistent with all of the trauma research and theory and neuroscience and so on in the last 30 or so years, which is that it's normative that to think of the self as multiple.
Yeah.
And that for some people that multiplicity is somewhat seamless, and there's a pretty coherent sense of self that can encompass different aspects of self. But in traumatized people, those different parts of self become more and more discrete from each other or dissociated from each other. And I think that Alexander Stein's work around attachment theory in authoritarian groups reflects this in the sense that you become divided when you're in a cult between the part of you that wants closeness to the leader and the part of you that's terrified of the leader. And these become dissociated from each other. And it sets off a dissociated state of being that makes you more and more a deployable agent of the leader. That's just a very oversimplified review of her idea, but I think it's a very good idea, and I'm very taken with it myself because it speaks to my own experience. Another way that I was divided or dissociated while I was in the cult was as a spokesperson and an educator, I conveyed that City Yoga was the greatest thing that had ever happened to me, and that my life was, a bed of roses and a heaven full of ecstasy at all times because of how great my guru is and how great my experience has been. And of course, privately, and I could only admit this after I'd left, privately, I was very depressed, very exhausted, very isolated, and very frightened.
Yeah,
almost all the time. So to be able to convey to the public one aspect of myself, how wonderful everything was and how great I felt, and to then at the same time experience, this depressed, seriously depressed identity, this involves dissociation. And so I think that's a real phenomena in cults, which is a kind of pathological dissociation as opposed to our normal tendency to be, more like one way when I'm talking to you on Zoom and more like another way when I'm eating popcorn, watching Netflix, which is what we can all relate to, that we are different in different contexts.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. And I agree with you completely. I sort of see identity. I mean, Jolly West in the 90s wrote a very interesting paper on identity. And I've sort of, it's a long time since I read it, but it stimulated me to think about, in the 1980s, around about 1988, shortly before I first met him. And what I take from it is that in an ordinary, I don't know what normal would be, but an ordinary human being, there's a kind of XY axis where the one axis is what my mood is. So if I'm feeling irritable today, or if I'm feeling cheerful today, that will be an aspect of identity that I give forward. And the other is, as you say, who I'm dealing with, whether I'm watching a movie on Netflix or talking with somebody, or talking to my cat, or somebody I'm employing, or
right.
one of my children. So the mood I'm in and that thing, and that's normal. And all of those strands of identity are a kaleidoscope that's changing all the time to form what Jolly determined was personality.
Kaleidoscope is also a metaphor used in relational psychoanalysis. Yeah. Exactly.
And what happens in an authoritarian cult is that process is hijacked, and there's this division which you're talking about. My situation's a little different from many, because I was in Scientology for 9 years, but I was never on the staff. I was certainly never in the C organization. So I wasn't humiliated or abused at any point.
Right.
Because there's this very special policy in Scientology as to celebrities.
Yes.
And even though I wasn't making any money, I was a writer, I was a painter, I was a musician. And so I had special kid glove treatment for 9 years. I had no idea that they were breaking and entering and burgling government properties. I didn't know that the organization people were on a rice and beans diet perpetually and working a 19-hour. I had no idea of these things, because exactly what you're talking about, that the member who is the total convert, who is completely isolated and engulfed, as Alex Stein says, their perception is this division that yes, here I am in paradise. That's what I've got to project to everybody. But actually, I am scared beyond belief of being punished.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I did. And as long as I was around the guru for as long as possible, no matter how badly I was doing, and I kept getting worse and worse. By the end, especially when she was directly attacking me on a daily basis, I could barely speak. I was falling apart. And then I was told one night in a private audience with one other person witnessing, I hear that you want to leave. And I was terrified. Oh my God, please, no, don't make me leave. Meanwhile, I had become like, I had lost all my dignity and practically lost my ability to think and speak. And yet I was begging to stay, the way an abused child, when the child protection people come to take them away, they beg to stay with their parent. Yeah. And well, I was lucky, because she said, no, of course you want to go. So, and then it was arranged for me to go back to New York and work and so on. And it was then that I somehow found the wherewithal to want to have a life, and a good one, and to figure out how I could make that happen. And I was still a follower for 2 more years, but in those 2 years, I got married, and I chose a career path. And it was just at the beginning of my marriage and the beginning of my new career that I left Siddha Yoga. But that incredible trapped experience that you can't imagine a life outside of it, and meanwhile you're dying inside. I think that's true for a lot of people.
Yeah, I had a conversation with a friend of mine a few years ago, and he was involved with Scientology for, I don't know, about 40 years, from the age of 17. And along the way, some years before, I'm trying to work out when he left, about 7 or 8 years before he left, he read my book, which is now called Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky. And he decided that he couldn't leave because he would lose his immortality.
Right.
And for me, that was just a risible idea. Nobody, if I'm immortal, I'm immortal, but it is. And so I'd never bought into that in Scientology, but that frightened him. He turned to his son, who was on the call, and said, why did you leave? Because he'd independently decided to leave, having grown up in the group, of course, and gone through Scientology schools and all of this. And he just looked at his dad and he said, I read John's book. And it was really distinct, this idea, the cognitive dissonance that,
yes,
it's too dangerous to think about this, even though the evidence is all there to say that, Hubbard very simply said honesty is sanity. And he was evidently dishonest from the own contradictions in his own autobiographies. Game, set, and match, done.
Yes.
He was insane by his, but that's too difficult to comprehend, because your whole identity, your whole sense of self, I am, a Scientologist. That's what I am, for the members.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. Well, this has been great, and I think that we should end on a win, as they say in Scientology.
That sounds good.
And it's just been such a great pleasure talking with you, and I hope we can do this again sometime in the not.
Thank you, John. I appreciate so much the invitation, and it has been a pleasure for me as well. Thanks so much.
Great. This is my guest, Dan Shaw, and I'm John Atack. Thank you so much for your time. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.